nerds, what's up? Today I'm coming at you with a review of Tailored Realities by Brandon Sanderson, which is his book of collected sci-fi and fantasy short stories that is coming out the first week of December. This book includes 10 short stories that are mostly previously written. Some of them have been published online or through other things, but have never been published like in a collection or in print, along with Moment Zero, which is a brand new novella that is published and released for the first time in this novel. So the funniest thing about this is when the list of stories was released, I was like, oh, I've read most of these, just like because I have been a Sanderson fan for a decent amount of time, I own PDFs of a lot of these stories. Like some of them used to be sent out when you joined a mailing list like years ago, and some of them just like came to me through fans. This sounds bad, but this was like a very normal practice if they were like little ones that had been published in random places. And I've read a lot of random Sanderson. Like I read his video game adaptation novellas. I kind of forget which one those are now. I can flash them on screen. And I've, read Leech. I've read other stuff. And then I started reading this novel and I was like, well, I'll just reread the ones I've read and realized I haven't read a single one of these. I have PDFs for like 6 of them. And I guess they've just been sitting on my phone and I never got around to them, which you guys probably don't care about, but was hilarious to me because honestly, it was great. It was great because I got to experience this whole thing as a brand new reader, even though a couple of stories in here I feel like are pretty famous. And I think I know why I skipped them, but anyway, I digress, it doesn't matter. Overall, I gave this collection a 4 stars. So when I was reading, I kept like a little paper and I ranked or rated, I should say, every short story as it came out. And when I averaged them all together at the end, it was a 3.75, which I'm rounding up for 4 for a very specific reason. I feel like my experience reading this book was a 4. I'm going to talk a little bit more about this later, but a couple stories in here are very, very early works of Sanderson's. And I didn't necessarily know that when I was reading them. This book also contains a little postscript from Sanderson for each story, which I also just loved. I love hearing about craft, and these are like they're just like a page, they're super short, and him talking about the short stories, which is amazing. So he would say when a couple of these were really early, and the funny thing is I didn't know that going into the story, and I could almost always tell looking back, because I'd be like, oh, writing wasn't like quite up to par. So I ranked it a little lower, and then I'd read the postscript and I was like, this is one of the earliest things I ever wrote. And so because of that, and because of how much I love that kind of craft stuff, I rated a 4. Several of these stories worked super well for me. So today we are going to go through a couple sections. I'm going to talk about my top stories from the collection. I'm going to talk about my least favorite stories from the collection. Then I'm going to talk about whether or not I think this is a good introduction to Sanderson, because I think that's always a kind of interesting question when you have an author that has so many works. And then I'm going to end talking a little bit about Sanderson in general. It'll make sense when we get there. Okay, let's talk about Tailored Realities after the jump. So my 4 favorite stories in this collection were Snapshot, Dreamer, Probability Approaching Zero, and Moment Zero. 2 of those stories were longer, more novella, and 2 of those were actually quite short. So I think it's kind of fun that there was a mixture. So first up, Snapshot. Snapshot's the one I was convinced I had read, and now I'm realizing I think I thought one of the Legion stories was called Snapshot, and that's why I kept avoiding it. I was like, well, I've already read all of Legion, because I read the combined Legion, the one that put together, so I didn't know the individual names of them. Anyway, that's a stupid mistake, but I need to explain why I hadn't read Snapshot, because I think it is one of Sanderson's most talked about, like non-Cosmere stories. I loved Snapshot. It was such a fun story and just classic in the way that Sanderson can keep subverting your expectations, things that you expect to happen and how they happen differently. And I just enjoyed that a lot. I think this is a great representation actually of Sanderson's works in terms of characters and motivations and plot, how he can take a simple idea that has been done before but make it feel fresh. That's what I think Sanderson's best quality is. Snapshot reminded me a ton of Minority Report, which was a movie I loved. Growing up, I watched it so much. And funnily enough, he then mentioned Minority Report in the postscript. So I was like, okay, yeah. So totally I was right there on like the vibes. He also said this is the one that has been most optioned for a movie, and that makes so much sense to me. I could see this being a movie so easily. I am surprised it hasn't ever made it through. But yeah, Snapshot is as good as everyone says it is. I really enjoyed it. So correct me if I'm wrong, Dreamer is one of the ones that I think is harder to get your hands on. I think maybe less people will have read this, even though I did randomly have a PDF of it that I just haven't read, whatever. Dreamer is such an interesting reading experience because it's a really short one. It's definitely a short story. And for the first like 90% of it, I'm like, this is fine. This is fun. Like whatever, like it's going to be, average. And then it ended in a very unexpected way. And I loved the ending. And it totally changed how I felt about the whole story. And what's funniest about that is that in the postscript, Sanderson said that his editor didn't like the ending, but he did. And I would love to know when people read this, or if you just happen to have already read this, tell me what you think about that, because the ending made the story for me, but I guess for some people it doesn't. Again, I love that. Then we have Probability Approaching Zero, which I think is one of the shortest stories in the collection. It's not the shortest, but it's only 6 pages. I loved this one. I felt it was pretty unusual for Sanderson. It was his attempt at flash fiction, something very, very short, and I thought it worked very well. I am somebody who loves when there's ambiguity with things, and I ended that and I was thinking about it like, what did that mean? And I thought about it a lot, and then I read his postscript and I was like, okay, I kind of got half of what he was going for, and I felt like if I had more time to think about it, or if I discussed it with somebody, I would have even got more from it. And I just liked how unusual it was. And well, we'll talk about that more. I guess I can talk about it here before I go into Moment Zero, since that's the big one. One thing I love about seeing Sanderson in short fiction is that he's very experimental, particularly when it's not Cosmere. I feel like recently he has said things, now this is like no proof of this, but he has said things that made me think sometimes he feels a little trapped or bogged down by like how particular he has to be about Cosmere things. It's why I think his secret projects felt so unique and fresh, like Tress and Yumi, because I think there was a sense of freedom when he was writing them, because he didn't really think anything was going to happen with them. And I get that sense of unrestraint from a lot of the stories in here. So even some of the stories that I thought were only okay, I still enjoyed reading them because of the ideas and the unrestraint. It's a great reminder of how good Sanderson is at just having ideas. In my original Cosmere ranking video from several years ago, so a lot of stuff hadn't been out then, like no secret projects, no one to whatever. I, in my top 5, put 2 of his short works. I put a novella and a short story. It's funny because Sanderson has such a reputation for like these long, beefy works, but I actually think he can really get a lot across in shorter works, which is why I enjoyed this. Anyway, that was a really long aside about that flash fiction, but I'm curious how people will feel about that story. I feel like a lot of people might hate Probability Approaching Zero, but it's totally the kind of thing I like, and so I really enjoyed that. Now let's go into Moment Zero, which is obviously really the advertised highlight of this. It's the longest thing in there. It's a full novella, and I ended up really enjoying it. It wasn't my top. I think Snapshot is still my favorite from the collection, but Moment Zero was interesting because when it started, I was just like, okay, I'm enjoying this, but it wasn't necessarily blowing me away. I felt like it was hitting a lot of similar things, and this is on me for not realizing that if anything, Sanderson knows how to build to a Sanderlanche, even in a novella. So as it kept going, I kept getting more invested, and it kind of slowly snowballed to the end where I was just fully invested and really loved what he did and how he took the various character interactions and story beats and how he weaved them into something I wasn't necessarily expecting. And I think it's very successful at doing that, and it really feels like a Sanderson novel in miniature. It has kind of like a slower beginning, then it ramps up, and then it gives you that classic, like unexpected but completely set up ending in a way that was really satisfying. So I quite enjoyed it. Those are my 4 favorites. Let's talk about my 3 least favorites. So I'm obviously not talking about all 10 in this collection, but the others were in the middle. But my least favorite were Mitosis, Defending Asylum, and I Hate Dragons. So what's interesting is 2 of these 3 are tie-in short stories. So Mitosis is a tie-in story to his Steelheart Reckoner series. And then Defending Asylum is like, I guess it's a tie-in to Skyward, but it was written a really long time ago, so I think it's more of like an inspiration for Skyward. And then I Hate Dragons, which was totally not related to anything. Why I'm saying that this made me laugh is that even in Arcanum Unbound, like, my least favorite tended to just be the tie-in short stories. I liked the short stories and novellas most when they were completely separated and like on a new world, or like, okay, I understand that The Emperor's Soul is technically a tie-in to Elantris, but it's not. Do you know what I mean? You wouldn't really call it a tie-in, just because it takes place on the same planet. So this kind of isn't a surprise to me. So let's start with Mitosis. I think the reason Mitosis was my least favorite, I don't know if I really read this in a fair way necessarily, but I've read almost all of Sanderson's works. But only 2 things I haven't experienced yet because they're younger fiction. I just haven't gotten around to it, which is the Reckoner series and the Rhythmatist. I know a decent amount about the Reckoners just because my son loves that series, but I haven't read it yet. So I'm reading Mitosis, and the whole time all I could think of is, I feel like this is spoiling me on the Reckoners. And I kept talking to my son, like, it told me this and this, is it spoiling me? And he's like, Mom, it's not a big deal. You know that's gonna happen. It happens like in the first book, it's fine. He's totally my child about spoilers, as you can tell. I've taught him well, apparently. I'm very proud of him. But I couldn't help it. The whole time I just kept thinking that. I don't necessarily think the story would have excited me outside of that anyway, so I don't feel bad saying it was one of my least favorites. But I just want to say that that was a factor. Like, the whole time I just kept thinking, like, would it be better if I go into the Reckoners not knowing this? It probably doesn't matter, but that was my reading experience, so there you go. Defending Asylum, so this one's interesting as one of the lowest rated ones that I did because I did love the idea of it. I quite liked the Skyward world, and I really loved this as an inspiration for where that went. There was so much interesting stuff in Defending Asylum. I just thought the execution wasn't the best. I just, for whatever reason, noticed some things about the writing, and it stuck out to me. And so I rated it, and then, I turned the page and read Sanderson's postscript, and suddenly everything made sense. Apparently he considers this like the start of his professional career. This is one of the oldest things he's really written in terms of published works. And I think you can tell. It kind of reminds me of Elantris, where like, I like Elantris, but you can kind of tell that it's one of his earlier works, and I think he's improved since then. So it did make sense to me. But again, I think that's one of the reasons my least favorite. We're going to talk about those things in a moment. But and then finally, I Hate Dragons. I love the idea of Hate Dragons once it was explained why he did it. I'm not going to give that away, but in his postscript. But again, I ranked these before I had extra context because I didn't want the context to affect how I felt about the story. And I Hate Dragons was totally fine, but it did not excite me in any way. I think it's a very cool experiment once I realized what he was trying to do with it. But overall, just like as a story, didn't do a lot for me. So let's go into, is this a good introduction to Sanderson? And here's the deal. Are individual stories in this a good introduction to Sanderson? Yes. Do I think this whole collection is? Not necessarily. And this comes with, there are 2 very different types of short story collections, and I have 2 perfect examples. If you guys have been around, you know that I am obsessed with the short story collection, The Paper Menagerie by Ken Liu. I recommend it all the time, and I always say it's a great place to get into Ken Liu's works. Currently, I have also been reading Dream Songs by George R. R. Martin, which is a collection of his short stories. I'm on volume 1 right now. I would not consider Dream Songs introduction to George R. R. Martin's work. I would never give Dream Songs Volume 1 to someone and be like, here's your introduction to George R. R. Martin. Would I give some stories in that collection to them? Would I perhaps give The Ice Dragon? Or I know a lot of people like to recommend The Songs of Laia as a starting point. Yes. And what are the key differences here? The Paper Menagerie is a collection of Ken Liu's work that is highly regarded, all of his short stories. They don't come from postscripts. It is a collection of short stories. Dream Songs is a collection of short stories, but it is also a retrospective on George's career. He has these kind of introductory essays about the time that he wrote these stories, talking about his influences and what was going on in SFF at the time and what his writing career was like. And because of that, Every individual story in there isn't the best, but you are experiencing a look at George's writing career, and some of them are incredible, and some of them really are there to kind of show how he's evolved as a writer. In my opinion, Tailored Realities is much closer to a Dream Songs sort of thing than a Paper Menagerie sort of thing. He's talking and putting in here about very early works in his career, and it's really a collection of, here's a lot of different ideas I had and how I executed them. Here's a lot of different examples of how I like to write and how I like to do things, which is fascinating and fun, and it's why I enjoyed it so much, and it's why I think that the whole is greater than the sum of its parts, because I enjoy things like that so much. So in my opinion, I wouldn't give someone Tailored Realities as their first experience to Sanderson. However, I would be like, you should read Snapshot. You should read Moment Zero. I think those two are a good introduction to things that Sanderson does well. But yeah, that's why I think like necessarily as a whole, it wouldn't be my personal favorite starting spot, even though it would be totally fine. Like you could start there. I just probably wouldn't choose it. The last thing I want to say that I maybe should have said earlier, this is kind of random, but I love that it's called Tailored Realities. Most short story collections I've read and loved always just name the collection after one of the stories that maybe thematically ties them all together, or often just like the most famous story in the collection. And that's what they tell it. This is titled on its own. It's called Tailored Realities, which is none of the stories in there. And I think it is such a good title for what all the stories are about. It totally unifies every story in there. And I think that's underrated as a skill. And I just really liked this collection as a whole in terms of they thematically all go together. You see themes reoccurring within them. And that also really kind of made the experience of the short story collection for me. So the last thing I want to talk about here is kind of random, and I didn't know where else to put it. So this is a new Sanderson review, so we're going to just put it here, which is why I still like Sanderson. There's been, since Wind and Truth in particular, although it's been ramping up for a while, there has been an attitude shift. And in my opinion, this is only an online phenomenon, as so many things are. But there's been this shift where I have gotten a large increase of comments of things like, I can't trust anything you say anymore because you have rated Sanderson well. It happens a lot to me actually now. And just a lot of videos have coming up about why people are giving up on Sanderson completely and they're done with him and they're not reading his books anymore, which is fine. That's a totally valid opinion. I don't care. You do what you do. I've also just gotten an increase of people accusing me of lying about liking Sanderson books because apparently I just want to be in their good graces. Okay. So, first, there's this side of this where I think increasingly in every aspect, not just the book space, people, some subsets of viewers think that a reviewer needs to reflect their exact opinions, or they are untrustworthy, or that they can never listen to them, which is kind of just weird to me because no one's ever going to agree with you 100%. It's why generally when I follow reviewers, I have reviewers that I know generally think how I do. I never expect them to consider what I like 100%. We never match fully, but I can kind of trust them in general to get my general vibe. Or I watch reviews and don't listen to a star number and see why someone didn't like something. I know if something's going to bother me or not. And I have a lot of people like that on my reviews. They'll be like, oh, that bothered you. I know it won't bother me, so I'm going to read it. Whatever. That's a whole separate conversation about how people act to online, I guess, personalities. But what I really want to say is my tastes are constantly changing, and definitely recently I've been looking for some different things. And I think those things I've been looking for a lot aren't necessarily always Sanderson's strengths. And so people assume that I'm lying or I don't like Sanderson anymore. And it's funny because while I was reading Tailored Realities, I finally found a way to articulate why I still love reading Sanderson's work. And it's because Sanderson still gives me a very particular feeling when I read. And it happened multiple times during Tailored Realities. It is the feeling of, oh my gosh, I wasn't expecting that. Like, he can just really turn things and surprise me, and I love being surprised in a book. There were so many times where I physically smiled because something happened that I totally wasn't expecting, and it caught me off guard, and I loved it. And he also is so good about giving you triumphant moments that come from hardship rather from just success. He is so good at writing triumph in a way that feels so hard-earned, that leaves you feeling so good and satisfied even when things go wrong and you lose things you wish you didn't lose. I was excited reading these stories. They made me feel a certain way. And some people don't care about that as much, and for some people that's not enough, and that's totally cool. But I have a lot of different favorite authors for the reason that different authors give me different things. So no, I don't read A Song of Ice and Fire for the same reason I read the Stormlight Archive. They give me different feelings. The same way when I read a Ken Liu book or a Robin Hobb book, they give me different things. So this was probably obvious to most of you, but on the off chance that someone hears that and it just changes their perspective a little bit, I'd appreciate it. I don't really care if you don't trust me because I still like Sanderson books. Like, that's your prerogative. I'm not gonna tell you to like watch my reviews or trust my reviews. I don't really care. But don't accuse me of lying about it because that's just silly and it is obnoxious. I'm just going to be truthful. It's obnoxious. I liked this because I liked it and it made me feel good reading it and it excited me. And that's the end of it. Okay, well, except for that weird aside that I felt like I had to get off my chest. I really enjoyed Tailored Realities. It was not necessarily what I was expecting. I wasn't expecting like the postscripts with kind of the retrospective a little on the career. It was such a great thing for me to read while I'm reading Dream Songs. I thought that was very fun, particularly since I'm really considering like George and Sanderson, like two of my favorite authors. I love hearing about their respective careers. I'm super curious to hear what you guys think of this when it comes out. It comes out the first week of December when we're at Dragonsteel, and I just don't know the actual date it comes out. When's Dragonsteel? I think it's the 4th through the 6th. And I think the book releases Friday. So I think it comes out December 5th. I'm going to say that. Let's hope I'm right. And also, of course, comment if you've read any of the short stories that I talked about, since some of them have been available previously. Oh, and speaking of Dragonsteel, just in case you're here, I am going to be at Dragonsteel this year. I will post on my community tab kind of where I'm going to be and all of that. So definitely come say hi if you happen to be at Dragonsteel this year. And with that said, as always, if you like this kind of content, please like and subscribe. That's the best way to support me. If you want to see what I'm currently reading as well as other nerdy rants, you can check me out on Instagram at bookborn.reviews. I'll see you next time. Bye.